Welcome, everybody. I'm Bob Lee, the president of the China Society of Southern California. The China Society was founded in 1935. This year, we are celebrating our 85th anniversary. Pre-pandemic, we had dinners in Chinatown followed by a cultural program on China. This is our first solo Zoom program, which is made possible with the help of our co-sponsor, the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. The Chinese Historical Society has helped us for many years with audiovisual aid. I am most gratified that many of its members have joined us today, some for the first time. Thank you for your support. I begin the program with a special thank you to the Huntington Library and Gardens. About 15 or so years ago, I read an article in the Times about a Chinese architect who was designing a Chinese garden for the Huntington. I invited him to speak to the China Society, and he accepted. This was the beginning of many talks on the Chinese garden, Chinese-related exhibits and culture. June Lee, Duncan Campbell, Li Wei Yang, Phillip Bloom, and Katie Chu, as well as the volunteer Don Alschuler, have given us wonderful programs. Prior to the garden, there was not much related to China at the Huntington. There were some Chinese porcelains that decorated some of the rooms. David Kamansky, the director emeritus of the USC Pacific Asia Museum, had told me that while studying the archives at the Huntington on Grace Nicholson, the antique dealer who built what is now the buildings of the museum, he found references to my family's business, Jinhing Company. My grandfather and father had supplied Grace Nicholson's treasure house since the early 1920s with jewelry and antiques. But these were just minor things, more related to Pasadena history than to Chinese culture. This changed in a great way with the Chinese garden. Because of the Chinese garden, the Huntington reached out to the Chinese American community in San Marino and the San Gabriel Valley to become involved with the Huntington. And because it was a Chinese garden, the Chinese Americans, not just in San Marino and the San Gabriel Valley, but all over the Southland, have done just that. They have become involved with the Huntington. And it isn't just the garden of the Huntington that had become interested in things Asian. The Huntington Library established a Pacific Rim Collections Department, now headed by Li Wei Yang, that actively seeks archives of Asian Americans. A recent acquisition is the archives of Gilbert, Florence, and Leslie Leong. As many of you know, the Leong family has a prominent role in the On Gold Mountain story. The Leong family also have been active members of the China Society for 3 generations. Gilbert's parents owned the Suchow restaurant, which was the site of the inaugural meeting of the China Society in 1935. There are less than 20 honorary life members of the China Society during its 85-year history. Gilbert was one of them. Through the garden, the Huntington has become a major center for the learning and enjoyment of Chinese culture. It's a great accomplishment, which I am very thankful for. Well, now let's begin our major program. Phillip Bloom has his PhD from Harvard University and was an associate professor at Indiana University. He is the June and Simon Lee Curator of the Chinese Gardens and the Director of East Asian Garden Studies at the Huntington. And most of all, he is a very talented, accommodating, and knowledgeable friend. The expanded garden opened on October 9th. I wanted to go, but even with all of the garden programs the Huntington had given to the China Society, I don't know enough about the Chinese garden to even begin to fully appreciate them. I asked friends who had visited the expanded gardens. I attended 2 excellent Zoom programs by Phillip Bloom and Jim Fossum in October. These were wonderful programs that all of you still can see on the Huntington website, but they were not about the new expansion. I went online. Most of the sites had beautiful pictures by people who had just visited, but no explanations. Then it dawned on me, why not ask Philip, the curator of the garden, to give me and you through Zoom a tour of the new garden expansion. Of course, I wanted the talk to be immediately because I wanted to see the garden while there were still some fall colors. Crossing my fingers, I emailed Philip and asked if he could give a talk in 1 or 2 weeks. Amazingly, he replied 3 weeks would be better. So here we are. So please welcome Philip, curator of the Liu Fang Yuan Chinese Garden.
Thank you, Bob, for your very kind introduction. And thank you for your ongoing support of the Huntington. You've really been a good friend to the Chinese Garden and to the Pacific Rim collections. I will try to share my screen and take you on a tour of the garden. So let's see. And at any time while I'm speaking, please feel free to enter questions into the Q&A box that should appear either at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on what kind of device you're using. And then at the end of the program, we'll try to respond to some of them. So Bob kind of covered some of the first part of my talk, which is great. But I'd like to recap a few things. And actually, I'm going to start at the end of my talk, which is with this photograph that provides a view from the newly expanded garden over the existing garden. And before we get into what the new garden entails, I think it's worth just talking briefly about why there's a Chinese garden at the Huntington in the first place. Bob talked a little bit about some of this, but there are a couple of points I'd like to reiterate. And also, I'd just like you to show you some photos of how the existing garden was created. So if you've been living in Southern California for the past 20 or so years, you may well remember that the Chinese garden at the Huntington opened to the public in 2008. Construction actually began in 2004, but the idea predates this by about 15 years. So in the late 1980s, the director of our botanical gardens, Jim Folsom, began thinking about creating a garden that simply would be a collection of Chinese plants, and specifically Chinese plants that are commonly used in American gardens. So things like azaleas or peonies or camellia, chrysanthemum, even roses. These are all plants that are Chinese in origin, but that probably many of us grew up with in our own backyards and just assumed were American or European or from some, perhaps we never even thought about where they were from. But as Jim began learning about what a Chinese garden actually is, he began to understand that a collection of plants would not really be sufficient. So as Bob mentioned, in the late 1990s, we began collaborating with Chinese American architects in Southern California to come up with some kind of general concept drawings of what a Chinese garden at the Huntington might be like. And in particular, these architects focused on creating kind of scenes throughout the garden that would be a combination of architecture, rockeries, waterways, and eventually plants. Around 2000, we began collaborating specifically with a design and construction firm in the city of Suzhou in southern China. Suzhou, as probably many of you know, is one of the garden capitals of China. It includes, it has, I think, 8 UNESCO World Heritage Gardens, most of which were constructed between the 16th and 19th centuries. And we began working with a company that actually was founded to maintain historical gardens. And beginning in the late 1970s, they also started to design gardens, and they developed really the plan for ours. And really since about the year 2000, we've had a master plan for the Chinese garden. And over the course of the past 20 years, we've gradually been filling in that master plan. And so the expansion that I'll be showing you today really is the culmination of 20 years of planning and about 16 years of building. So, and I should just say, in the image that you see here, these are 2 early concept drawings from the team in Suzhou. The one on the right shows the first phase of the garden. The one on the left shows the garden in its entirety. And even though this drawing was rendered probably around 2002 or 2004, it actually directly corresponds to what we just finished building. There are only maybe 2 exceptions to this drawing on the left, 2 additions. So the garden was structured around a seasonal rain pond that truly would flood every year during the rainy season. I've been told by docents who were here at the time that it was particularly smelly in the spring when the waters started to recede, and it became very muddy and kind of swampy. But it provided, a natural pond site around which a garden could be constructed. And so in this photograph, you're standing at the southern end of what's now the Chinese garden, kind of near to where the tea house is, and looking north to the San Gabriel Mountains. You can just barely make out Mount Wilson behind one of the trees. So the first order of business was to line the pond with concrete. We worked both with American contractors and with about 50 artisans from Suzhou to complete some of this work. This is a small crew from Suzhou standing in the lake bed, which has been newly completed. Then they began constructing bridges and laying general infrastructure. The wooden forms that you see there are the arches in one of the main bridges in the garden. They began lining the banks of the lake with rocks, all of which were imported from China, from the Lake Tai region. Truly, if a couple of years ago, we had to drain the lake to get rid of some algae and to deal with some circulation issues. And truly, when you remove all of the water from the lake, you're faced with a scene like this. There's so much rockery below the surface of the water that's invisible when the garden is in its complete state. All of the buildings in the garden, of course, look traditional, but they had to be designed to meet California building codes, which means that even though the architecture seems to be timber frame, all of it has a steel frame underlying it so that it will be seismically sound. The steel frame is simply covered in a kind of wooden veneer that is executed by carpenters from China. The walls similarly are masonry walls, typically involving quite a lot of concrete and plaster. And I love this particular photograph. This is the main courtyard in the existing garden. The tea house would be just off to your right. The main entrance to the garden would be just off to the left. And it gives you a sense of kind of what the skeleton of the entire place is like. There's a skeleton of steel. There's the curtain walls are made from aluminum. And then even the tile paving is rendered in this very skeletal fashion and then is filled in by artisans with pebbles. And it typically takes an artisan about one full day to complete a square meter of this kind of pebble mosaic. The mosaics are rendered just simply using mortar and pebbles. Over the course of the day, they fill in all of the pebbles and then apply water in the evening to allow the mortar to harden. Of course, among the last steps in creating a garden is to plant. And here you can see that because of the way the garden was constructed, some of the trees had to be almost airlifted in. We had to rent gigantic cranes in order to bring in some of the boxed pine trees. And to erect some of the rockeries, we had to rent even larger cranes to place these rocks on steel frameworks that would again ensure that even in the most severe earthquake, the rocks will remain standing. One of the architects for the garden likes to joke that the safest place in the garden during an earthquake is right next to this particular rock, because it has such a massive steel frame, and there's a concrete caisson that extends underground at least 6 feet to hold everything in place. This is just a photograph of the first team of artisans that worked on the project from 2004 to 2008. So it's thanks to the effort of these people that we have the garden that we do today. And actually, there are a few people in this photograph who participated in every phase of construction, and from 2004 to 2008, from 2012 to 2014, and then from 2018 to 2020. So that leads us to the garden today, which I think many of you know very well. So the expansion project we undertook the expansion project between August of 2018 and October of 2020. As Bob said, the expansion just opened to the public on October 9th. And the groundbreaking was, I think, around August 15th of 2018. As I said earlier, it's not really an expansion project. It's really completing the master plan for the garden. And it's primarily just because of the scale of the project that we ended up having to phase the construction. And I'll talk toward the end of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about some of the totals of the garden that give you a very concrete sense of just how massive this project was. So again, with the expansion, everything just begins with steel frames and concrete foundations. It's a kind of, to me at least, it's very surprising to see something go from a framework as simple as this to a building as complex as the one that you saw in my introductory slide. The building that you see in this photograph is actually the centerpiece of one section of the new garden. And it took probably 1.5 years to complete. And it's quite remarkable to watch it transform from a simple steel framework into a steel framework covered in wood and then eventually faced in tile and plaster. And ultimately, the landscape, of course, is planted. All of this work, again, was done by a combination of American construction workers and Chinese artisans. We had, I think, 52 artisans from Suzhou who participated in this final phase of construction. So I like this photograph because you can see quite clearly the interplay between steel and wood. All of the brownish red pieces that you can see are steel, part of the steel framework, and then the artisans are assembling, kind of like a giant IKEA set, the wooden members of the building. And actually, even with the final buildings, what you see from the exterior is a combination of wood and steel. Most of the beams that you can see are wood, but periodically some of the steel framework is revealed. And because of the way the buildings are painted, it ends up looking as though it were completely wooden. This is just another quite dynamic photograph of the process of these carpenters reassembling the building. All of the wooden pieces all of the tiles, all of the rocks, all of the carved tiles and wooden placards are manufactured in China and then imported to the US. Everything for this project, though, is specific to our project. This company is now engaged in building gardens all over China, and they do have kind of like a set garden package that you can pre-purchase, and it comes with tiles and rocks and wood and things like that. For the Huntington's garden, we specified, the precise design on all of the tiles. We specified the particular names we wanted for the buildings. We specified the poetry that we wanted to appear on the buildings. We specified what kinds of plants we wanted to be carved into some of the decorative features of the buildings. So it's really, the garden really is specific to the Huntington. This again gives you a sense of just how some of the expansion was completed. None of the walls are load bearing. They're all just these kind of curtain walls that are filled in. And one of the more amazing features, at least to me, in the garden is that these very elaborate windows that you can see in the colonnade or gallery here are all pre-manufactured, of course, in China. They're built up by creating a design out of nails and then filling that design in with layers and layers and layers of kind of like a plaster of Paris or something like that. And they're, of course, created at a very specific design. And then meanwhile, all the way across the ocean, American construction workers are are looking at plans and are figuring out how to fit those prefabricated windows into the walls. And I guess somehow, thanks to the power of math, they're able to do it with absolute precision. Here's again a photograph that gives you a little bit of a sense of some of the unseen parts of the garden. So you'll see quite a lot of photographs of these walls in just a minute, but you'll notice in the lower left-hand corner of the photograph, there's a rockery. And you can see that that rockery actually extends quite far below the level of the concrete. And so really the rockeries that you see in the garden, they're like icebergs. You only see maybe half to 2/3 of them, and then there's another half to 1/3 that's underground stabilizing everything. This exemplifies that even more clearly. Quite literally, half of the rockery is invisible in the completed garden. So as I mentioned, for this phase, we had about 52 artisans from Suzhou who did everything from carpentry to pebble mosaics to various kinds of carving. They are pictured on the left in the blue shirts. And then they collaborated actually with several hundred American construction workers. There were many, of course, many different trades involved in creating the garden. And on the day that we were able to finally take a portrait photograph of the artisans, there were probably only 40 or so Americans on site. But in the entire project, there were several hundred people that ended up participating in the construction. So now I'll try to take you on a tour of the completed garden. The expansion actually focused on 2 sections. This is a map of the entire garden. Toward the bottom is south, is the existing tea house. It's number 4, number 5, number 7. I'm not sure if you can see the numbers clearly. Of course, the lake is in the middle, and then the expansion focused on the north, which is outlined in blue. And then I'll talk later about part of the expansion on the west, which includes a number of different kinds of features. So here we are in the extant garden. Probably many of you recognize this view. We're standing at the very southwestern corner of the lake, and we're looking kind of northeast toward Mount Wilson. On the left side of the photograph, you can see a building I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but you can see this building that's the clear and transcendent pavilion that marked the northern end of the garden up until 2 years ago. And so everything I'll be talking about now is immediately north of that clear and transcendent pavilion. So standing in the clear and transcendent pavilion, this is the view you have to the north. This is an area called the Court of Assembled Worthies. It's a very, very large courtyard that we eventually plan to use for musical performances and other kinds of theatrical performances whenever we're able to do large gatherings again. We figure we can probably seat 250 or 300 people here comfortably. Some of the trees kind of limit the sight lines, but we can use, there are terraces both at the north and south end of this courtyard that could be used very comfortably for musical and theatrical performances. The courtyard is, I'll discuss in a minute, is actually centered on a building called the Flowery Brush Library. But it's bordered on one side by a kind of winding corridor that culminates in a small pavilion that you see toward the right hand side of the photograph. That pavilion is a charming little structure called Reflections in the Water of Fragrance and Fragrance of Orchids. And it actually overlooks a stream that flows from the very northern edge of the garden into the lake. This is just a close-up of the calligraphy that adorns the building. You can see in the center is a name placard that says Reflections in the Water and Fragrance of Orchids. And then on the pillars are a couplet. So 2 lines from a poem. And actually in this case, the calligraphy that was used for this couplet comes from a 14th century painter, Zhao Mengfu, who really is he essentially codified the literati tradition, both of painting and also of calligraphy. And to create this couplet, we actually took characters that he had written and kind of reassembled them into the order of the poem here. The corridor has a number of kind of whimsical windows and these interestingly shaped doorways. Many of the features in the garden are taken from a 17th century garden design manual called The Craft of Gardens. It was translated into English by Alison Hardy several years ago. And that garden manual includes designs for paving patterns, for window tracery, for doorways. It also includes diagrams of how to structure a roof or create buildings of different widths or depths. And the doorway that you're seeing here is adapted from that book, The Craft of Gardens. So this is a view, again, from the Court of Assembled Worthies looking north. And you'll notice in the foreground of the photograph are 3 very large carved stone tiles. And this is a little bit of a close-up of one of those tiles. Those turn out to be quite significant. They're kind of visual puns or rebuses. Each of them depicts different kinds of flowers and plants. And when the names of those plants are pronounced in Chinese, it actually creates an auspicious phrase. So in this case, the tile depicts at the top a kind of magnolia, which is pronounced Yuan in Chinese. On the right is a crabapple, a haitang. And then on the left is a peony, which is kind of colloquially referred to as Fugui Hua, the flower of wealth and honor. And so because Chinese has a relatively limited number of sounds, there are lots of homophones, so words that sound alike. So in this case, magnolia, as I said, is pronounced Yuan, and the word Yu can also mean, in the case of the magnolia, it means white, but it can also mean honored. With the crabapple, the second character of Hai Tang, the Tang, is pronounced the same way as the word for house. And as I mentioned earlier, peony is the flower of wealth and honor. And so when a Chinese speaker pieces these three plants together, he or she comes up with the phrase, "May your honored house be blessed with wealth and honor." So each of the three carvings in the courtyard is a different kind of auspicious rebus. One of them hopes that you'll be blessed with wealth and longevity without end. One of them prays that the garden owner or you yourself will have success in examinations. And these kind of rebuses are very common in Chinese art. There are many, many, many paintings, as well as ceramics and other kinds of decorative arts that incorporate these kind of visual puns. And as probably many of you know, it's quite common on certain holidays or on someone's birthday to present a painting or a ceramic vase or something like that that's adorned with plants that together construct a rebus. So we incorporated these carvings into the garden to give visitors a kind of entryway into this dimension of Chinese visual art. But the main feature of the northern section of the garden is the Flowery brush library, which is named after the magnolia. In Chinese, the term brush flower refers to the blossom of a bud of a magnolia, which in its form kind of resembles the form of a brush tip. Magnolia Hall actually is also the name of the main hall in the Humble Administrator's Garden in Suzhou, which is our sister garden in Suzhou. And further, this name is a kind of reference to an idiom that is called dreaming of a brush producing flowers. There's a story about a scholar who dreams that rather than producing characters when he writes, his brush instead produces flower blossoms. And the next morning when he wakes up, he suddenly finds he's able to compose incredible poetry and prose. So in naming this building the Flowery Brush Library, we were thinking of these different kind of references. Essentially every name in our garden has at least two references. Usually there's some kind of literal reference to something like a magnolia, but then there'll also be a literary or cultural reference, either to a building in another garden, to a particular idea, to a particular text, something like that. And the photograph that you're seeing is the calligrapher Fushan, who came to the Huntington to write the calligraphy that's included on the placard for this building. So the building kind of thematizes the intersection of plants and culture. The doors of the building are adorned. You can see that there are 6 panels for these doors, and they're adorned with depictions of flowers of the 12 months. So on the front side of the doors, we see months 1 to 6, and on the back side, we see months 7 to 12. This is actually the back side of the doors. You can get a little bit of a sense of just how finely they're carved. The designs for these doors were rendered by an artist in San Gabriel, Peifang Liang Wang, and then they were carved. She did the drawings, we scanned them, and then the artisans in Suzhou carved the underdrawings into teak, and then, of course, brought them to the US to be installed. The interior of the building is currently closed to the public because of COVID regulations. Indoor galleries are still not allowed to open in Los Angeles County. But eventually, when we're able to open this building, you'll be able to see a scene like this. We've designed the interior of the building to replicate the kind of studio space that a garden owner in the 16th or 17th century would have inhabited. A studio was the place where the garden owner would have written poetry, created paintings, perhaps played music, socialized with friends, that sort of thing. And to create this particular space, we commissioned a company in Alhambra to replicate specific pieces of 16th and 17th century furniture using walnut, which is we thought would be a more durable wood for a public garden setting. And we also worked with an artist in Colorado to create some of the scholars' objects that you see on the desk here, all of which, again, were modeled on 16th to 18th century scholars' objects. There's a selection of kind of reproduction woodblock printed books. We have some smaller objects like incense burners. Eventually, this table will be used to display Qin zither, and you can see some of the books here. But the goal for this space really is to make it accessible to the public through interaction with docents. So what we're planning is that eventually, when we can actually open the space, visitors will be able to come in, they'll actually be able to sit on some of the furniture, and by interacting with the docents, they'll be able to learn a little bit about the objects that are on display. So it's really meant to be an interactive space rather than just a kind of museum-like display of furniture. The other main building in the northern section of the garden is a new art gallery called the Studio for Lodging the Mind. It too is closed to the public still. We're hoping to be able to open our first exhibition in May of next year, but I think it's likely that that exhibition will be pushed back even further, simply because of, not simply because of the pandemic, but also because of the way pandemic delays will in turn cause future delays with mounting exhibitions. This is just a close-up of the placard on the building. For this expansion, we added, I think, about 30 or so named sites throughout the garden, and we commissioned calligraphers all over the world to do the calligraphy. This particular piece was done by a professor of Chinese art history, Bai Chen-shen, who was a professor at Boston University for a very long time and then recently moved to Zhejiang University in Hangzhou. And he's actually a historian of calligraphy, but he's also quite a famous calligrapher in his own right. I think Bob kind of asked me to give some insights that you maybe couldn't get just by walking around the garden. So I'm trying to tell you a little bit about why things are named the way they are, what kind of ideas went into the form of the garden, things like that. And so the name of this art gallery is actually one of my favorite in the entire garden. As I said, it's called the Studio for Lodging the Mind. And we took that name from an essay that was written in the 11th century. There was a scholar named Su Shi who was asked by his younger friend to write a kind of commemoration of this younger friend's art collection. And so Su Shi actually, he wrote a little bit in a slightly ironic way. He wanted to warn his younger friend that although collecting art can bring you great joy, it also has the possibility to make your life kind of miserable if you become too obsessed with collecting. And so Su Shi says, a gentleman may lodge the mind in things, but he should not leave the mind in things. If he lodges the mind in things, then even trivial things will suffice to delight him, while even rare things will not be sufficient to render him ill. If he leaves the mind in things, then even trivial things will render him ill, while even rare things will not be sufficient to delight him. So even though the essay is meant to commemorate a great collection of painting, it ends up being a warning about becoming too obsessed with collecting. And since the studio for lodging the mind at the Huntington will actually just serve as a temporary display space, it will be a place where we just have short-term exhibitions because we don't really have much of a collection of Chinese art of our own. We thought it would be kind of appropriate to name it after Susher's essay about just keeping things temporarily. On the front of the building are two carved tile panels. This is a close-up. The one on the left, of course, shows bamboo and rock, and the one on the right is a kind of withered old cypress tree. And these were drawings that were, these carvings were made after drawings rendered by an artist named Wang Mansheng, who lives in New York, but originally is from Shanxi province in China. And he's someone he's very much still, he kind of exists in the spirit of a modern day literatus. He composes poetry, he does calligraphy, and he's a very, very good painter. And around the time that we were thinking about what to put on these drawings, there was a painting actually by Susher that was suddenly rediscovered and put up for auction at Christie's in Hong Kong. And Wang Mansheng actually went specifically to Hong Kong just to see this painting because this work had been lost since the Second World War. It was in a Japanese collection. It had been photographed before the war, and then it was never exhibited again until 2018. And so since we were thinking, we had already decided to call the art gallery something after Susher's essay, we thought maybe some kind of painted subject matter for the carvings could be taken from Susher's work as well. And so Wang Mansheng decided to kind of take the idea of bamboo and rock from Susher, as well as the idea of a withered old tree. And he reinterpreted this Susher's painting specifically for those carved panels. And then the final structure in the northern section of the garden is, again, a structure that's still closed to the public, but that we hope will open in the spring, called the Pavilion Encircled by Jade. It will eventually be a restaurant. So it will not be a kind of formal sit-down restaurant. Much like the existing tea house, it'll be a space in which you place your order and then come to the exterior courtyard to sit and enjoy your food. However, we did try to ensure that this restaurant space would still kind of fit into the cultural or artistic program of the garden. And the way we did this is actually by commissioning an artwork specifically for the restaurant. So there's a very large wall immediately when you enter the restaurant space. And we decided to transform that into a huge video monitor. And we commissioned an artist, Tang Qingnian, to create a series of video loops that would show the garden or respond to each of the seasons in the garden. And so he created actually 5 videos, one spring, summer, fall, winter, and bamboo, that over the course of 5 to 7 minutes kind of combine painting, poetry, photography, video, and music to give a very distinctive artistic perspective on the garden. And so the idea is that when visitors come to the restaurant as they're waiting in line to place their order, they'll be able to see this video and gain a kind of artist's perspective on what they can experience outside. This is just a view of the side of the art gallery and some of the courtyard space in which eventually we'll have seating for the restaurant. The courtyard itself is called A Cup and a Poem, which is a phrase that refers to a 4th century gathering of poets at a place called the Orchid Pavilion. And they floated cups of wine along a kind of winding waterway. And if the cup reached them, they were expected either to drink it or to compose a poem. And we thought that, not that we necessarily want to encourage drunkenness in our courtyard, but we thought it was a kind of nice sentiment to incorporate the consumption of food and the composition of poetry in naming this particular courtyard. So there's actually a little bit more to the northern section of the garden that is still in process. And that's the section that you see outlined in light blue here. I'll take you through it just kind of briefly. It begins with a very large rockery at the head of the stream that feeds into the lake to the south. This is, to me, an incredibly impressive rockery. And rather amazingly, the reason it exists is to cover a restroom. So you actually go into the rockery in order to access the restroom. That rockery is in turn paired with some kind of more intimate spaces. There's a really beautiful grove of redwood trees, of coastal redwoods, called the Flowery Grove. And as you proceed through the grove, you come to this moon gate that actually has one of the best pieces of calligraphy in the garden over it. It says "Becoming an Image," and it's an incredibly dynamic piece of calligraphy. If you go through the moon, this gives you a sense of the wall that leads to that moon gate. If you go through the moon gate, you end up in a kind of winding corridor. The corridor is open currently, but the spaces just outside of it still are kind of in process. And I'm flipping through photos very quickly, but you can see there, again, quite whimsical windows and things. But this corridor exists to surround an amazing pair of California live oaks. It's actually 2 trees that have grown together over the course of about 300 years. And this entire corridor, and in fact, really the entirety of the northern section of the garden, was designed specifically around this tree. So the buildings have been spaced so that they will not interfere with the growth of the roots of the tree. Nothing was placed immediately within under the canopy of the tree in order to ensure that soil isn't compacted. Really, the garden was designed to protect this incredibly beautiful botanical specimen. And actually, throughout the northern section of the garden, when you visit, you'll see that there are a number of quite old live oak trees, and the garden really was designed to protect those trees. In some cases, the courtyards are even raised above ground level onto a kind of floating concrete pad. And that concrete pad floats precisely so that roots can grow underneath it. Eventually, this area of the garden will become home to a Chinese medicinal herb garden. We're working with an herb farm in Northern California that's providing about 200 species of different medicinal plants, and we'll eventually be planting them kind of in the eastern section of the northeastern section of the garden. I'm hoping that we'll begin laying out these beds sometime in the spring. If we're lucky, we'll be able to open it next summer or next fall. But botanically, it really will be a significant collection. A lot of the plants were collected or come from botanical gardens in China. There are a number of plants that are quite rare, and we're, I think, really looking forward to being able to use this medicinal garden as a way of just talking about the roles of medicine and talking about Chinese conceptions of medicine, but also the intersections between botany and medicine in pre-modern China. So the other main section of the expansion is to the west of the extant garden on a slope that overlooks the lake. This is a view, as you can see, more or less from the lake southwest toward the highest point in the garden. And the expansion is basically everything from this building on top of the hill to the right. And it's a space that's accessed by a kind of winding path through a number of different rockeries called the Jeweled Blossom Slope. We took this name from an 11th century garden that was built by actually a friend of Sushir named Li Gonglin, who had a massive estate in Anhui province. And one feature of his garden was the Jeweled Blossom Cliff that was some kind of strange geological formation over which flowers, trees and other kinds of plants had grown and would kind of rain down flowers. The slope is planted with ginkgo so that it has really brilliant color in the fall. There are lots of chrysanthemums, and then in the spring, we've planted many, many, many daffodil bulbs. This is, if you're familiar with the extant garden, there's quite a large waterfall that feeds into the lake. And this is a kind of view over that waterfall, which is planted with a number of different species of Chinese roses. Actually, almost all modern roses have Chinese roses in their DNA. In the 19th century, a number of roses were brought from China and were bred specifically to bloom repeatedly throughout the year. And much of that DNA actually comes specifically from Chinese roses, which we've included around this rockery. So this western section of the garden is called the Verdant Microcosm. It consists of both a kind of architectural compound as well as a series of more or less randomly placed walls. And this gives you a sense of how those two spaces relate to each other. But the entire space is devoted to the display of miniature plants, similar to Japanese bonsai. In Chinese, they're called panjing, which literally means potted scenery. I won't be talking specifically about every photograph, but as we flip through, you'll see quite a lot of examples of different panjing. This particular tree is actually, it's called a star cherry. It's a tree from South America that I guess is quite popular as a tree for panjing or bonsai in Southern California. A lot of the trees are actually Chinese elms, which is a species of tree that's used particularly in a Southern Chinese style of panjing, associated with Guangzhou, kind of near Hong Kong. And the man who's responsible for the design of most of our panjing was someone who was trained in Southern China in this Lingnan school. Throughout the panjing courtyards, there are both, of course, the miniature plants as well as full-size trees that have been kind of turned into panjing-like forms through training, through wiring, as well as through pruning. You'll see that there are a number of very eccentrically shaped panjing. This is one of my favorite. And I think one of the amazing things about panjing, as well as bonsai, is just how anthropomorphic sometimes these plants become. It becomes very hard, I think, not to see kind of human forms in some of these plants. There are also some that seem to me vaguely like visual jokes. Every time I see this, I can't help but laugh just because it's so minimalistic. You can barely even see the tree when you're standing in front of it. Others have much, much more robust forms. This again is a kind of Chinese elm. And the way these trees are created, actually, they're begun in the ground and they're allowed to grow for about a year. And then they're excavated from the ground. What formerly was the kind of taproot of the tree actually becomes the main trunk of the punjing. And then over the course of many years, branches are allowed to grow to different thicknesses. They're trimmed, then they grow in a different direction. They're clipped again, they grow in a different direction, etc. The punjing take a variety of forms. Some incorporate rocks and water. This, as you can see, it includes some small, very, very small Chinese elms that have been planted in perforated rock and complemented with water. The stand for this particular punjing actually was designed based on an 11th or 12th century painting. A local stone artisan, I think, took direct inspiration from some paintings like this to create this kind of multi-tiered stone base. And we'll now move toward the area of randomly arrayed walls, which is called the Cloudy Forest Court. This is a space that actually centers on a very, very large, very impressive rock called the Embroidered Cloud. And I very much hope you'll all have a chance to see it in person, because it's a kind of conglomerate limestone. And so within this very holy form, you actually see inclusions of all sorts of other minerals. And so it looks as though someone has embroidered the surface of this rock with all sorts of other different colors. And of course, since it's a rock, it's three-dimensional, and it really, it has very sculptural presence. It's kind of hard not to be transfixed by the rock and take photographs of it from all sides. As probably many of you know, one of the pleasures of a Chinese garden is that they're designed so that with every step you take, you have a kind of different view. And that's very true in this punjing court, where the doorways, the windows, as well as the paths ensure that you have a constantly shifting perception of the garden. Throughout the Cloudy Forest Court, of course, we have a number of other punjing. These are just specimens I particularly like. Again, this is a kind of Taiwanese ficus, and somehow, again, it's hard for me not to laugh at it. It looks like someone whose hair has been growing during the pandemic. And again, we have some quite interestingly shaped stone bases for these plants designed by a local artisan. These two, I think, took some inspiration from pre-modern paintings, such as the one that you see on the right. The stone base is actually a piece of limestone imported from China that had part of it shaven flat so that it could be used as a stand. Some of the punjing take these incredible cascading forms. Some of them take more classical triangular forms that you might associate more with bonsai. Sometimes they incorporate very interesting features, like you might notice the branch at the bottom of the tree has actually bent back on itself, which is something you see in nature, but which is something that would actually be trimmed out if it were a bonsai rather than a punjing. And actually, the reason these trees are displayed against white walls is so that visitors can appreciate the tree itself, so that they can imagine the tree as though it were painted on the white surface of the wall, as though the wall were a piece of paper or silk. But it's also so that you can appreciate the shadows that the plants cast on the wall throughout the day. And at certain times of day, those shadows really begin to resemble ink paintings. It really feels as though you're looking at, of course, a living plant, but also a plant that's been painted in ink on a piece of paper or silk. This is, again, one of those ficuses that I just find very, very humorous. And essentially all of these plants are under the care of one gardener, Mr. Che, who immigrated from southern China in the 1980s and who's been working at the Huntington for about 12 or 15 years now. He has a collection in his own backyard of about 200 or 300 different trees, and then at the Huntington, he takes care of our collection of 60 or so punjing. I'll just discuss this very briefly, but one other feature of the punjing court that you might notice are these carved tiles that adorn one of the walls. And these tiles are there actually to narrate a history of punjing. So the tile on the right is based on a painting from the 17th century of a Ming Dynasty punjing. It incorporates pine, plum, and bamboo, as well as a rock. And this seems to have been quite a common grouping of plants in punjing in the 17th century. The tile in the middle is taken from actually a Japanese book, but it's a Japanese book that was illustrating a Chinese style tea ceremony. And for this particular tea ceremony, which took place, I think, in 1876, they displayed a potted plant as well as flowers in a vase. And that potted pine tree was potted specifically in a ceramic container imported from southern China or northern Vietnam. And they probably tried to cultivate this tree in a way that they somehow associated with China. As I said, it was specifically for a Chinese style tea ceremony taking place in Japan. In the 19th century, there was a huge booming interest in Chinese style things, including Chinese style tea in Japan. And then the final tile is based on a photograph of a tree that was cultivated by our gardener, Mr. Che. I asked him what tree he was proudest of in his career, and he sent me this photograph, and he said that sadly, this tree, he had sold the tree to a collector, and the collector had killed it almost instantly. And so he wanted to have the tree commemorated in tile. So even though the tree isn't necessarily extant, it still lives on in visual form in the garden. And then finally, the expansion is complemented with two other spaces. There's a very large courtyard called the Terrace of Shared Delights that can be used for large-scale gatherings like our annual Chinese New Year celebration or Mid-Autumn Moon Festival. It can fit, we think, about 500 people fairly comfortably. Who knows when we'll have such large gatherings again. And then the structure that really surmounts the entirety of the garden is called the Stargazing Tower. And it sits on the highest point in the garden, and it overlooks the extant garden. It's named after its view of the Mount Wilson Observatory, which you can just barely make out in the background of the photograph. So I'll say this very quickly. I'll try to say this quickly. But just to give you a sense of the scale of this whole project, the garden has ended up being 15 acres. We have 61 named sites. The garden has ended up costing about $60 million. It was constructed, as you probably all know, in 3 phases, but it actually took about 33 years from the inception of the idea until the completion of the garden today. About 120 Suzhou artisans participated in constructing the garden. Hundreds more American construction workers participated in the project. More than 2,200 people have given $1 or more to the project, and the entirety of the project was underwritten by donations from private donors, a few foundations, and a very few corporations. We've ended up having about 95 calligraphic inscriptions in the garden. There are about 5,000 tons of Taihu rock to create the rockeries, and we're currently displaying about 30 punjing. In total, we probably have between 4,000 and 5,000 individual plants in the garden. It's a little bit hard to know because of the way that plants are categorized in our database, but it seems like we have 4,000 or 5,000 individual specimens. And to me, one of the most amazing statistics is that to create the garden, we had to move about 22 million pounds of soil. And that was specifically to create some kind of berms that define the western contour of the garden. And over the past 7 or 8 months, a crew of workers from the Huntington has been moving soil every single day. And they figure that they move something like 150,000 pounds daily, 785,000 pounds weekly, and probably 3 million pounds of soil monthly. And you'll be able to appreciate their work when you visit the garden in person. They've created these berms that are now planted with bamboo that create this really beautiful green backdrop to the western side of the garden. And to conclude, the reason we've done all of this, of course, is to make it accessible to the public. To do that, we've created a new audio guide for the garden. There are bilingual brochures that introduce the garden, bilingual English and Chinese. We have a number of new digital tools for understanding the garden, including a map of the calligraphy that's found in Liufeng Yuan. And perhaps most importantly, we've also trained a new class of docents. There are 60 eager docents who really cannot wait to interact with the public again, although I'm not sure yet when they'll be able to do so. But over the course of the past year, the docents and I did a kind of survey course of Chinese garden history and cultural history in order to understand the garden. And in the future, as soon as COVID is open, we're looking forward to all sorts of continued activities to make the garden an interesting, exciting place. We organize a variety of public programs, from music concerts to opera performances. We have a variety of school and family programs, including things like storytelling events or workshops in Weiqi, the Chinese version of Go or chess. We organize a number of lectures and symposia throughout the year. Usually we bring 6 to 8 speakers to the Huntington each year to talk about different aspects of East Asian garden history. If you'd like to keep informed about our events, or if you would like to watch any of the previously recorded talks that Bob mentioned, you can go to our Center for East Asian Garden Studies webpage, and you'll see a list of recent events, upcoming events, and you can also search recordings. One of the most exciting things, I think, is that we do have an endowment to bring an artist to the garden every year to create a new work in response to it. Most recently, Tang Qingnian created the videos that I was talking about earlier. Some of you may remember in 2018, we worked with a playwright, Stan Lai, to create a site-specific performance for the garden. In the future, we'll be working again with playwrights. We hope to work with poets, painters, and musicians, really in order to keep the garden alive. We really don't want the public to see this as some kind of static historical space. And so we think it's very important to invite artists to constantly reinterpret the garden. And as I mentioned, eventually we'll be displaying exhibitions in the studio for Lodging the Mind. Our first exhibition is called A Garden of Words. It focuses on the calligraphy of the garden. And we're hoping that it will open in May of next year, but I'm somewhat fearful that it will not be until the summer that we're able to open. And these are just some of the works that we'll be showing. It's all of the original works on paper that were used to create the inscribed placards and stones and tiles throughout the garden. So that more or less brings me to the end of the tour. I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have. And please. So it looks like we already have some questions.
So thank you for that presentation. I know usually Bob Lee has a question. I thought maybe before we go to the audience and the attendees, Bobby, if you have a question for Philip.
Well, I just want to mention that one of the people in the audience is Teresa's son, who has donated, her and her husband has donated Terry's father's collection of ink sticks. And I was just wondering when those were going to be on exhibit.
That's a great question. So hi, Teresa. We actually just conserved some of the ink sticks. We worked with a conservator at LACMA to stabilize them and to make them ready for display. We're planning to, we may be able to exhibit some of them in the calligraphy exhibition. Otherwise, we're hoping to exhibit them in a couple of future exhibitions. They require kind of specific conditions for display, so we can't have them on display for very long, but they will eventually be shown in the Studio for Lodging the Mind in conjunction with some of our other exhibitions.
Well,
So,
great.
Okay,
Are there
so-
more questions?
Yeah. Here, I'll start with the one that was first asked. So this is from Barbara W. Will the recording of this tour be available on the Huntington website? I would like my friends and family to view this. It is so interesting and beautiful.
I'm hoping that we can post it to YouTube or something. I don't know if we can put it on the Huntington website because it's not a Huntington sponsored event, but I hope that we can make the recording available on YouTube.
And also related to the Huntington, Cindy asks, is the Huntington Library open?
I should have mentioned that. Yes, the Huntington is open, but you need to reserve a ticket in advance. So if you just go to the Huntington webpage, there's a little ticket icon in the lower right-hand corner, and you can make a reservation to visit Monday, any day of the week except Tuesday. Usually the tickets are released every 2 weeks, and usually the weekends sell out fairly quickly, but lately there've been a lot of tickets available on the weekdays.
Okay, you sort of answered this near the end of your presentation, but Carolyn Wong asks, is there a visitor's guide with translations of the calligraphy in the garden into English?
Right, so the visitor's guide has translations of some of the poetry. There's a section of couplets on the back of the brochures. Let me also share my screen. We do have a digital map of all of the calligraphy in the garden, and the map, we're still kind of working through some technical difficulties, but the point of the map is for you to be able to open it when you're walking around the garden on using your cell phone, and then to actually be able to know what you're looking at. So the page that you're seeing now is the Chinese Garden webpage at the Huntington website. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, you can access the audio guide. And then if you scroll down a little bit further, there are these online tours. And so if you go to the calligraphy of Liu Fang Yuan and press start, you'll be taken to another page that introduces the calligraphy. The page is actually designed really to provide a general introduction to calligraphy. And you'll see that there's a link here for the map. And here, it'll take just a moment to load, but eventually you'll be able to see that there really is a map, and hopefully it will load quickly. Anyway, the map you can see here's a relatively small map of the garden on the left, but each of these dots represents a piece of calligraphy in the garden. So for example, this dot shows the studio of Pure Sense, which should have loaded by now. Oh dear. Okay, so for example, the Hall of the Jade Camellia. This is a photograph of the inscription in situ. This is a photograph of the original work of calligraphy. And then on the left in this box, you can see the translation of the name Hall of the Jade Camellia. You can see who the artist was. You can read a short description of the work, a biography of the artist. And then we've also translated all of the additional inscriptions. So the signature line, whenever possible, I've tried to translate the seals. And then you can also find out information about the source of the name. So in this case, Jade Camellia refers to a kind of plant that was related to the tea plant and was associated with a particular city in China. It's also the name of a Ming Dynasty scholars studio. So you can use this map to explore all of the calligraphy in the garden. Currently, the function that's meant to link it to your location on when you're walking in the garden isn't working, but eventually you really will be able to trace your steps on this map and figure out what you're looking at in the garden.
Okay, we have a question from Oki Russell. What is the significance of the rockeries in Chinese gardens? How are they crafted?
That's a great question. So the rockeries are one of kind of 5 essential features of Chinese gardens. Usually you count rocks, water, plants, architecture, and then text, so the calligraphic inscriptions. The rockeries really are meant to evoke the feeling of wandering through kind of a mountainscape. And the best rockeries really are a nice combination of soil and rocks, and they really do give you the feeling that you're out in the middle of some kind of remote mountain range. The way that they're created kind of depends on the scale. So this, as you could see from some of the photographs earlier, the smaller rockeries really are just individual rocks that are set in relation to each other, kind of secured with some concrete or mortar, and then soil is piled around them to obscure their supports. The much larger rockeries, like the waterfall in the garden, actually involve a massive concrete frame. There's for our waterfall, there was actually a retaining wall that was constructed with concrete, and then the rocks were attached using, I think, steel rods and concrete. And so they're kind of pieced together around a framework to, again, primarily to ensure their seismic stability. In pre-modern China, those frameworks simply were constructed out of wood. And in some of the gardens in Suzhou, as you're walking through the rockeries, you can quite literally see the pieces of wood around which the rocks were secured. So hopefully that gives you some sense of how they're created and why they're there.
There's a question from Gail Natzler. She says, Chinese columns with their vertical material of wood, yet appearing to sit on a pillow stone, have always interested me. One can imagine the way they were constructed here, with steel cores within the wooden surface was very different than the way they were originally constructed in China. Was there some structural reason for placing a wood column on a stone pillow? What construction difficulties were there when placing the steel columns through the stone pillows?
Those are wonderful questions. So the reason that the pillars in pre-modern buildings are elevated on the stone column bases is primarily to prevent wood from rotting. So if the column were set directly into the ground, particularly in moist environments, the columns would rot quite quickly. So simply by elevating the columns on a piece of stone, pre-modern builders could ensure that their buildings would last a little bit longer than they would if they were set directly in the ground. With creating the kind of weird hybrid of steel and wood that structures our buildings, we did run into a number of difficulties. Most of those difficulties were worked out during the first phase of construction when I was still in graduate school. I wasn't here. But what the previous curators have told me is that actually the elements of the steel frames were prefabricated in the US. They were then shipped to China so that the artisans could figure out how to encase the steel frame in wood. Those wooden sections were then fabricated and everything was shipped back to the US. For this current phase, because the artisans had had the experience already of prefabricating wooden materials in order to fit the steel frames were simply erected on site in the US and the wooden members were prefabricated in China. That said, we did run into a couple of problems this time. I think in the course of designing the buildings, the building code changed, and that meant that some steel flanges were had to be larger than they were indicated in the drawings. And so the artisans had ended up manufacturing the wooden components to fit steel flanges that were smaller than what they were expecting. And so when all of the components were shipped to the US and the carpenters began trying to fit them to the steel frames, they ended up having to hollow out some of the wooden components in a way that they hadn't anticipated. That actually led to several weeks of delays as the carpenters had figured out how to make everything fit together.
Mary Carlson asks, can you talk about the basis for the punjing, stone and ceramic work, and the artists for these vessels and platforms?
Yes. So most of the actual ceramic pots that our gardener uses, I think, are just purchased locally. Most of them are made in China. Today, the kind of most valued ceramic pots for punjing tend to be made of a kind of purple clay associated with the city of Yixing near Suzhou and Shanghai. It's the same purple clay that's often used in teapots, and it's slightly porous. It kind of breathes well, which for punjing is good because typically with punjing, you really try to control the amount of water that the plant takes in each day. You want the water to evaporate relatively quickly so that the plant will develop a very robust root structure. So typically, punjing and bonsai are planted in quite poor soil, sometimes even in gravel, and they're placed in pots that will breathe relatively easily. In the past, actually glazed pots were more common, but for contemporary punjing and bonsai, which tend to really prioritize the development of root structure as well as the development of branch structure, which parallels the roots, they've switched to using a lot more unglazed, porous pots.
Okay, so Gail Natzar has another question. Since many of us who love Chinese art also love things made of jade, I'm wondering if there is any jade around the building of that name, or if the word jade is used symbolically. What can you tell us about this?
So in the garden, we have a couple of evocations of jade. There's the Hall of the Jade Camellia, In that building, jade is being used to indicate whiteness. So the jade camellia was a kind of white camellia. We also have the hall surrounded by jade, and in that case, the jade is being used metaphorically to refer to the surrounding greenery. And in Chinese, the words that we're translating as jade are yu and cui. So it's actually two different kinds of jade. Yu is a white kind of jade, cui is a greenish jade. We actually don't have any jade in the garden right now. We're simply using those terms metaphorically.
Here's a question about you personally. Teresa Whitener asks, Philip, what is your training?
I'm trained as an art historian. So I wrote a dissertation on Song Dynasty Buddhist art. And in the course of my graduate training, I actually did do some work on gardens, specifically on rocks, actually. And then after my first job was as an assistant professor of Chinese art history and at Indiana University. And while I was at Indiana, I started teaching about garden history as well. Somewhat surprisingly, the chair of my department, when he interviewed me, specifically asked if I could teach garden history. And the city in Indiana where the university is located is Bloomington, which has a thriving garden culture. And so the chair of my department was an avid gardener, and it turned out that I had a number of auditors in my classes who were avid gardeners as well. And so it was kind of through the process of teaching that I actually learned quite a lot about gardens and was able to train myself for this job.
There's a follow-up question from Oki Russell. So the rocks we see in the rockeries are natural? The holes and porous features are natural? They look almost man-made.
That's a good question. So yes, they're natural in a sense. 1,000 years ago or 1,200 years ago, when these rocks first became popular for garden rocks, they were harvested directly from a lake bed, and the rocks themselves are limestone. And in this particular lake, the action of the water eventually eroded holes in the softer parts of the rock. And so originally they were truly natural rocks. Probably by about the 11th or 12th century, demand for these rocks outstripped the sources. And so people began drilling holes in limestone and then submerging it in the water for a couple of generations, and then harvesting the rocks, 20 or 30 years later, after the drilled holes began to appear more natural. Today, a lot of this kind of holy limestone is harvested all over, or quarried all over China. There are a number of different sites, and it's actually the same layer of limestone that exists in certain parts of the US. So if you visit actually Indiana, Kansas, Missouri, Kentucky, a lot of the regions that have karst formations, the limestone that you see there is of approximately the same age and approximately the same composition as the very porous limestone associated with Lake Tai in China. Most of the rocks in our garden, I think, are truly natural. We just have so much rock that I can't quite imagine that much of it is artificial. For the smaller examples of what are commonly called scholars' rocks, those often are drilled and polished and kind of fabricated. There are a number of they're not exactly rock artists or artisans, but there are a number of people who deal with rocks who do really shape the smaller scholars' rocks that are very commonly appreciated today.
All right, there's a question from Tai Ling, and I actually have the same question. Can you speak a bit more about how nails were used to create the varied shaped windows?
That's a good question. So basically what they do is take a pattern. Well, they take a piece of plywood, they trace a pattern on it, and then they outline that pattern with nails. And the nails effectively define the outline of what the window will be. And then as far as I understand, I haven't seen the process in person. I've only seen the process in process, and I've seen the end results. They then somehow layer some kind of plaster or cement to create to fabricate the window to the depth that is necessary, which is usually something like 3 inches, I think. And then they're able to remove the plaster from the form. I know I'm explaining that very poorly and very imprecisely. As I said, I haven't actually seen the process, but when I did visit the studio of someone who was creating these windows, and that truly was how it appeared. It seemed that they traced the outline in nails, layered plaster and cement until they created a certain depth, and then kind of removed everything from the form. Once the window is fabricated, it's packed very securely and then shipped to the US. Actually, today, a lot of these windows are not created by hand. The ones in our garden actually were created by hand, but now it's much more common to use machinery to create them. And so if you visit a number of gardens in Suzhou, you can see some windows that were created either in the 19th century or in the 1950s. And then you'll see that there are some replacement windows that have much harsher lines than do the earlier examples. And typically windows with very even thickness and very harsh lines were created using some kind of machinery.
So in those windows, the nails are still in there.
I'm not sure. I think they are. They may actually use some kind of wire as well to build up the pattern, but I'm not certain.
Okay, there's a question from Albert Chang. Is there much activity on Chinese gardens in either the USA or elsewhere?
Yeah, so there's at least one other large Chinese garden project in the US. For a long time, there's been a plan to build a Chinese-style garden in Washington, DC. That project has not yet ever really taken off. And in China itself, there's been a huge amount of garden building activity. Actually, the company that built our garden was recently commissioned by the government in Beijing to do all of the design for a new government center outside of downtown Beijing. They've actually been designing all of the parks, all of the kind of, infrastructure for that new government center. Similarly, there's been a lot of interest in building private gardens in China recently. There are companies all over China now that will build traditional Chinese style gardens and that also build more contemporary Chinese style gardens. There are also quite a lot of course, practitioners of Chinese garden design and garden architecture who teach at universities like Tsinghua University in Beijing, Tongji University in Shanghai, Nankai University, etc. And then I think I see someone mentions also that there's an important Chinese garden in Portland, Oregon, near the Chinatown. That garden was built around the year 2000. It was built slightly before ours. And one of the reasons that we chose to work with the company that we did was because they also built the Portland garden, and it had to incorporate some responses to local, Oregonian building codes that involve seismic considerations. There are, of course, many, many other Chinese style gardens throughout the US and actually throughout the rest of the world now. There's a small garden in Staten Island in New York. There are gardens in Vancouver. There's a garden in Montreal. There's a garden in Ireland, New Zealand, Australia. I think even Malta has, the country of Malta has a Chinese style garden now. And most of those gardens are built either by the company that built ours, which is the Suzhou Institute of Landscape Architecture Design and the Suzhou Garden Development Company. There's also a major company in Shanghai that has been building gardens internationally.
Okay, and one last question from Mary Carlson. I really enjoyed seeing the conservatorship process of Blue Boy. Will something similar happen with works donated for this area of the Huntington?
So, in a sense, yes. Actually, if you visit the garden right now, you can see that some of the wooden panels from the first phase of the garden are being conserved almost as we speak. Over the course of the past, 12 years, some of the wood panels have been damaged quite severely by sun and heat. And so they're currently being stripped of their finish and will be re-oiled. Similarly, I showed you the wooden panels on the doors of the Flowery Brush Library. Those are rendered in teak and they're simply oiled, and those will have to be re-oiled every 2 years probably. We have some other teak features in the garden that need to be refinished as well. So that kind of work will be ongoing. We also plan to bring artisans back from China periodically to do repairs, particularly to tiles. And some of you may be familiar with the thatched pavilion called the Pavilion for Washing Away Thoughts that's in the canyon between the Chinese and Japanese gardens. That thatch was just restored about a year ago. And we'll probably have to redo the thatching every 10 years or so. So that kind of work will be ongoing and will be visible.
Okay, it looks like those are all the questions. So I think Bob Lee has some things to say.
You're still muted, Bob.
I think Philip deserves a round of applause. I am so overwhelmed with with what he gave us. It was more than I imagined. I think that all of us now can visit. Is it okay?
That was the quick version.
Yeah, well, I think that I think we can now visit the new expansion of the garden with a new appreciation, not just for the beauty of the garden, but the purpose of the garden. And I think all of us will enjoy the pleasures of the garden. And I hope that maybe we still have enough time to see the garden with some fall colors.
Yeah, the ginkgos are just turning gold right now. It's a great time to go, actually.
Okay, so I think we'll be having a lot of people from our audience who will be going.
Please do.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
I'd also like to thank Felicia Tabbing for being the hostess of this Zoom webinar. I think without her, we would have probably been lost. So thank you, Felicia.
Thank you.
And I also want to thank the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California for making this meeting and our next meeting possible. I would like to tell you that our next Zoom meeting will be the Chinese Historical Society meeting on Wednesday, December 2nd at 7 p.m. And I think that's going to be a very interesting program. They've invited us to co-sponsor it, and I am very interested in attending. The title of the program is Herbs and Roots, a history of the Chinese doctor in the American medical marketplace. Philip has just told us that the Chinese garden is going to have a new herb garden. Our society has had tours of the Chen Art Gallery in Torrance. And as you know, the Sunrider Company, which is surrounds the Chen Art Gallery, has their herb garden, which we visited. And hopefully the talk will give us a better understanding of how these herbs that are grown in the gardens are used. The other thing I would like to also mention is that many of the people in our audience are descendants of herbalists and herb doctors, including Gilbert and Gordon Hom. I understand that Gilbert supplied his research on herb doctors to the speaker. Gilbert and Gordon's grandfather was a noted herb doctor, S.P. Lee, who also happened to be one of the founders of China Society and a very early board member. So I think that our December program will be something that all of you should attend. I want to thank all of you again for attending, and I guess I can close the meeting. Thank you again, Philip.
Thank you, Bob.